Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Colonial Society's stated meeting for December, which is coming to us in a really hybrid fashion. We are both here at 87 Mount Vernon Street, and we have Nicole Breault, our speaker, coming to us from Virginia. We don't have any business to conduct before the meeting, do we? Okay, good. Let's get a gallery. Hello, Nicole.
Hello, Bob. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Welcome back to the Colonial Society.
Thank you.
Nicole actually first presented a version of this in 2019 at our graduate student forum, when she was then a doctoral candidate at the University of Connecticut, working with Nina Dayton. And she since has earned her PhD and is now at Roanoke College in Virginia as an emerging scholars postdoctoral fellow. And I'll just give a brief synopsis of what you have done so far. It's an interesting career trajectory. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Vermont, actually studied political science, and then switched to history. She came to Massachusetts and worked at the Peabody Essex Museum, as well as the Lynn Historical Society, and earned a master's in history at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and then went off to the University of Connecticut. Actually, her master's thesis was on the Mashpee people. And since then, she has been working on the Night Watch of Boston, really an interesting subject, which has brought her to archives far away from Boston, really to find out the story of what was happening with the Night Watch. So last year, she was at the David Center for the American Revolution as a predoctoral fellow. She's had an extraordinary number of fellowships over the years, including the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium Award, and she was a Middlecow Fellow at the Huntington Library. And it is a delight. I'm sorry you could not be with us in person, but it's a delight to have you back at 87 Mount Vernon Street. So now, without further ado, I will turn this over to Nicole Breault.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to share my screen here and get this going for everyone. Okay. Thank you, Bob, for that generous introduction. And thank you so much to Anne Cecile and the Colonial Society for inviting me to speak at your meeting today. And as Bob mentioned, I had the privilege of being part of the Colonial Society Forum in 2019. And I'm just so grateful to all of the participants, both my peer participants and all of the members who were there to kind of give me feedback then. It was instrumental to the project. And I'm sorry that I can't be with everyone in person today. But what I'd like to do with my talk is try to give you a brief introduction into Boston's 18th century Night Watch. As Bob mentioned, the research was the subject of my doctoral dissertation, and now a project that is being converted into a book manuscript. And in this project, I drew on a neglected collection of 18th century night constables reports to illuminate the role of local level policing in both the development of an early American city and in the context of an empire in crisis. So I argue in the larger project that watches were central to the administration and economies of early American towns. They kept the peace, facilitated social welfare, and conducted community surveillance. And they presented those in violation of law to local authorities. Boston was distinct in its forms of experimentation and approaches to watchkeeping, and it establishes practices that were unique among British Atlantic port cities, namely the technology of writing. By the 1760s and 1770s, the town created a mature institution and practice that was capable of supporting the functions of governance during times of peace and crisis. One such innovation was the use of local level policing as a mechanism to maintain civil authority in local jurisdictions during the two occupations of Boston by the British Army. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like to acquaint you with some of these aspects of the project, but particularly introducing you to the institution itself, the research on the men that I have served, that I've conducted, and a kind of a little bit of an insight into the work that the Watch performed. So to begin, I'll just give you a brief kind of background into watchkeeping itself. For centuries, cities and towns across the globe have relied on the use of watches to keep the peace and safeguard the sleeping public. Watches helped deep resonance for individuals and communities in late medieval and early modern period. Setting the watch shaped how people understood time and the night itself. Watchmen occupied a steady presence in the cultural and spiritual imagination through scripture, literature, art, but they also occupied a physical space. They walked walls and guarded gates, perched in church towers and patrolled streets. Most able-bodied adult men in any city or sizable town would have been called upon to fulfill their civic duty to perform watch service. And many, namely travelers, individuals without lodging, or perpetrators of crimes, would have also encountered watchmen through their routine movements. Watchkeeping was deeply ingrained as an institution and a practice in the fabric of governance and community. The transference of watchkeeping as a method of policing to British America brought this deep tradition of using police officers as vectors of the law to the colonies. Watches supported colonial projects, local economies, slaveholding regimes, and maintained the moral and social character of urban and rural locales. Various forms of watching were developed and used to maintain safety and order. The Lord's Day watch occurred weekly and monitored for violations of the Sabbath. Military watches were convened when necessary for defense. At certain times, ad hoc watches were brought about to deal with instances such as outbreaks of disease or riots. But among all of these forms of watching, the night watch was most constant. So within British North America, watches followed different trajectories of development. And as Bob mentioned, I have done research further afield for this project. And part of one of my chapters digs into how these watches developed in different locales. Just for example, the policing order of places like New York and Philadelphia and Charleston were greatly influenced by particular things that were not as important in Boston. Namely, for Charleston and New York, the management of enslaved populations particularly shaped the form of policing in each of those cities. This is something I will dig into a little bit about how that influences policing here in Boston in just a minute. But to be sure, while ubiquitous across all of the colonies, there is no one typical form of watchkeeping that develops. While they vary in focus and character, a constant that remained was the use of local efforts to preserve the peace with a blend of different appointed officials. And this is underlined by humanist and Protestant ideals that dictated kind of some of these founding principles of what a well-governed town looked like. Town employees, such as overseers of the poor, constables, watchmen, and warners, were used to monitor geographic bounds assigned to wards, rendering issues of poor relief, taxation, and security more manageable. My work kind of just contributes how watchmen, fit into this larger scope of working officials. So in Boston, and this is just to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of the institution itself, and then we'll dig more deeply into the men who served. Watch practice coalesced over the 17th and 18th century, while remaining, so certain elements remain from the medieval roots, and it slowly grows into an institution that reflected key features of Boston's core characteristics. In the city-state of Boston, Mark Peterson has identified, quote, political economy, self-governance, freehold land title that created equity through commonwealth and encouraged market production, free trade through the Atlantic world for Boston's merchants, and communitarian ethos grounded in religion of the Puritan churches, end quote, as foundational to Boston's character. I argue in my larger project that the institution of watching in Boston matured over time to support these integral threads. The performance of quotidian policing by Boston's Watch was essential to uphold community, morality, the economy, and contributed to the development of Boston as an early port city. So for its first 130 years, Boston experimented with different forms of watching to meet the needs of a growing town. The changes and developments of the first half of the 18th century were foundational to the system that emerged in the 1760s and 1770s. Growth and adaptations of the watch during this period were critical to its emergence as a stable institution of local governance. Rather than rely on watches manned with voluntary members and conducted by day constables, the town shifted to the use of watches organized and directed by justices of the peace and town selectmen. The institution of this type of watch marked a turning point in watchwork, but most significantly, a shift from a charitable rotating duty performed by householders to a steady compensated service. If you will, a shift from a kind of voluntarism to a new phase of wage labor. So by the early 1760s, a standing paid watch was set each night to act as the apparatus of local government while people slept. They began at 9 p.m. in winter and 10 p.m. in summer, setting out to walk routes set by the town selectmen until daylight. They carried an hourglass to determine the time and a staff that indicated their office, making themselves known by announcing the hour and weather as they walked. Nightly, they observed and listened, listening for signs of fire, distress, and disorder. The watch did not have powers of arrest. Rather, they were instructed by the town selectmen to hail all persons passing along in the night and to suppress any roused riots and disorders. The watch used its discretion to aid individuals in need of assistance and to detain those found violating the law or social norms. And at the end of each month, the head constable or night constable for each watch unit submitted a report to the town selectmen. And this is the general form that the watch took during the period of the 1760s and 1770s and beyond. So one of the questions I wanted to explore in doing this project was to try to figure out who the men of Boston's watch were. Who were the men who manned this particular institution, what brought them to service, and what made them stay. So what I found was that night constables and watchmen, they're expected to conduct themselves as representatives of the town, and by the extension, they were seen as behavioral constants for the community. While on duty, members of the watch were expected to behave with, quote, sobriety, temperance, vigilance, and fidelity. They received orders not to be noisy and to operate under strict decorum. Watchmen were also asked to execute the office with, quote, resolution and firmness, but behaving with discretion and calmness. The selectmen reminded watchmen of the importance of their compliance, that, quote, the security of the town demands it, and you may be assured that your continuance in this place to which you are appointed altogether depends on it. So under these circumstances, I was very interested to see kind of what men, as I said, populate this office. Night constables and watchmen were not men of wealth or top office holders. I did not find an upward mobility out of being a watchman that you would find someone who would move on to become, say, a selectman. You don't see that with this particular office. And despite that, they occupied positions that were valuable to town governance. Boston's watch in the 1760s and 1770s were comprised of men who came to watch service for a variety of reasons. Many served in their positions for a decade or more. Others joined the watch for short periods, serving less than a year or two. It is likely that some came to join the watch to participate in the governance of the town. Others came for a wage. They represented various social and economic positions. Some occupied a lower middling status, but many came from the lower sorts and working poor. Most of Boston's watchmen likely worked for a wage during the day, either as in a position of a laborer or other skilled trade. Records show that night constable Stephen Sims was a leather breeches maker. Fellow constable Benjamin Burdick was trained as a barber, advertising his services both as a, quote, peruke maker and hair cutter, end quote. Watchman David Lennox Sr. and Jeremiah Rhodes were listed in various records as house joiners or housewrights. No record that I have found thus far has ever identified watchmen as a discrete occupation, which I think in and of itself is interesting. To supplement their income beyond day labor and nighttime watching, many watchmen also served in other town offices that paid a stipend or a wage. At least 12 watchmen were appointed as grave diggers between 1760 and 1775. In January 1764, at the height of the smallpox outbreak, the town paid watchman David Lennox Sr. to dig an additional 10 graves in the North Burying Ground for those who had died from their sickness. Several watchmen or constables, including Isaac Townsend, worked as a bell ringer, a position that was paid by the town treasurer each quarter. In March 1773, when Boston introduced the use of street lamps for the first time, watchmen Robert Fowle and Thomas Sharp were both employed also as lamplighters. Other positions held by constables and watchmen include engineman, clerk of the market, scavenger, hospital keeper, messenger, sexton, and clock keeper. Watch service may also have been a strategy for some men to avoid becoming a public charge. Several former watchmen and constables found themselves in need of public assistance after leaving their positions as well. Fewer than 12 months after his discharge from the Dock Square Watch, Night Constable Edward Ireland appeared on a town list of poor and sick, and he received aid on several occasions. Within 2 years, he and his wife had entered the almshouse. Former watchman Moses Barron and his wife were admitted to the almshouse in April 1778, and fellow watchman Ichabod Williston in April 1790. Watchman Jeremiah Rhodes was one of the few that I found that were dismissed for poor behavior. He was found to be receiving stolen goods in 1768. In the following year, he received over 4 shillings in aid from the overseers of the poor. I found that the men of Boston's Watch lived in all areas of the town. However, the majority did reside, as one would imagine, in the north and south ends. Watchmen and constables followed different denominations of Protestantism and attended a variety of churches. 2 watchmen from the Dock Square Watch, Ruby Worrall and John Wilson, and 2 townhouse watchmen, Edward Langford and Ichabod Williston, belonged to the Anglican Church as members of King's Chapel. I found numerous records where actually a couple of them stood for each other for their baptisms for their children, kind of showing a little bit of a relationship beyond just watch service. Constable Benjamin Burdick attended the Long Lane Meeting House, a Presbyterian church formed by Scotch-Irish Calvinists, while Constables Edward Ireland and William Dorrington were members of the Old South Church. Now, while many of the stories of Boston's watchmen are lost to us, what I know for sure from this research is that Boston's Watch was comprised of ordinary men who lived typical lives in an 18th century port town. They labored and served, some struggled with poverty, and at times they flourished. Watchmen came from a variety of neighborhoods and churches and backgrounds, entering at all different phases of life. And as I found, as I read on in terms of their reports, which we'll talk about in just a moment, they faced the challenges presented by war and dislocation, the pressures of politics, and everyday concerns of family, all while walking the streets of Boston to keep order. And we learn much about the men of Boston's Watch from the reports that they wrote for the town. The emphasis on writing as a mechanism of watchkeeping in Boston was unique. No other port city in the British Atlantic in the 18th century developed a requirement for writing in the colonial period. And beginning in 1761, in Boston, night constables were required to both keep a personal journal and to submit a written report at the end of each month. In addition, each Wednesday, they were to appear before the town clerk to offer an oral report of what had transpired, again, using those personal notes to relay this information. Some of the things that are included in these monthly reports included the completion of rounds, weather, and attendance, but also there are deep details on the general social milieu, disorderly places, and notable incidents. I'll just say, just for for all of us, I'm sure we're all interested in how many reports I'm talking about here. So in my research, I was able to bring together a total of 293 reports that were written between 1763 and 1776. And to give you a sense, these are the main branches of the Night Watch. The West End Watch was created last. It was not created until late 1774. That is why it has such a low percentage of surviving reports as well. And this kind of gives you a little bit of a breakdown so you can see the contents of the reports as well. So for 133 of these 293 I collected, there are detailed stories of different incidences that happen. On 160, there are what I call other. These are administrative records. It's attendance, cost of candles, who's missing, back payment information, which is also had been, something that was extremely valuable to the project overall. But this gives you a sense of kind of the breakdown of what kind of content we see within these reports. And I will also mention that for the time span that I am talking about, there should have been about 700 reports written. So what has survived, is far fewer than what would have been written. I have a few years where there are no reports, and for the longest time it was just kept me up at night. What happened to these reports? And I was reading while I was doing research actually at Boston College at the Burns Library in a scrapbook that was put together by one of the police chiefs in the 1860s. He pasted in this article that was written talking about an artifact of old that was found. And it was someone had found a report from 1772 in the trash in Back Bay. So I was just, I'm like, they threw them out. They threw my missing reports out, was what I then, what kept me up at night thinking about that. But to give you a sense, these are the materials. This is the kind of volume of materials that have survived that I found thus far, the majority of which are all housed at the Boston Public Library, except for two, which are actually at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So perhaps they're lurking in some Back Bay attics, and one day I'll be able to bring some more of those together. But that is kind of just to give you a little quick overview of the reports that I am talking about. So what is in these reports? Give you a few examples here. The records convey not only to me in the way that I read them, not just information that they choose to include, but we also see a bit of material culture evidence about the conditions in which watchmen are working. The surviving reports appear and they've been submitted in a range of conditions. Here are just a few examples of what some of them look like. Watch constables compose their reports on different size sheets of paper with varying textures and thickness. Some used even small scraps with tattered edges, perhaps an attempt to conserve paper. These are obviously being written in a time prior to form reports. So I've never seen actually any kind of paper allowance in any of the records that I've looked through. So I'm operating under the assumption that they provided their own materials to write these reports. Some show signs of moisture, as you can see in a few of these, perhaps dampened by a spill or moistened from being tucked in close to a breast on a warm day. And others contain burn marks and evidence of exposure of writing by candlelights. The reports themselves also lack uniformity of content. Without a formula or a template, it allowed each constable to develop their own reporting style. The South End Watch reports varied in detail and length. Between 1763 and 1774, 4 different men served as the head of the South End Watch. One, for instance, Thomas Bradford, wrote in a very thick and clumsy script on these very tiny scraps of paper, which his compositions almost consisted always of attendance records. Edward Ireland, who you can see in this larger report to the left, the constable of the Dock Square Watch, composed over 50 reports. He writes the majority of them, they're all in his own hand, and he spells words phonetically and always includes a good amount of information about these nighttime incidents. 67 reports were written by Isaac Townsend, and who you can see on the right. He wrote in a pleasant, neat script and added little flourishes to the ends of his capital letters. Townsend's reports included precise details and suggest the seriousness that he brought to his duties. On occasion, he even referred to personal hardships. For example, in July of 1767, he reported, quote, "Myself absent 3 nights, occasioned by the death of one of our family, who was unfortunately drowned, namely my son-in-law. Thursday, the 16th, 17th, he was found, 18th, buried." He once even asked the selectmen to forgive him for missing a report, citing the reason as a lameness on his pen finger. And down in the right corner, another long-serving constable was John Martin, who always included the cost of candles in all of his reports. And just as an aside, the cost of candles does not change between 1763 and 1776 somehow. But again, these men, they nightly walk, they listen, and they write. And they're gaining a deeper knowledge by doing so of Boston's 16,000 inhabitants. And the town's built environment, its proximity to the sea, and its general bustle gave Boston just a very distinct landscape and soundscape for them to master. Now, where did they work from? Well, scattered throughout the town were impermanent movable structures built to house the town watch. Between 1763 and 1775, 5 watch houses stood strategically positioned across the town, 3 in residential wards and 2 in the commercial center. The language, though, of these watch house locations are extremely vague. In many instances, the town records, you would find the phrase "where it now stands," rather than a geographic marker, or a finding point was used to describe the location, as in next to someone's shop. Watch houses do not appear on any of the major maps of Boston, nor have I found them on any smaller surveyors maps. However, in doing deep research and in cross kind of referencing, I was able to locate where all of these were placed over the period of the 1760s and 1770s. The 2 circles for the West Watch and the New South Watch are larger because they were moved to various locations along the street over time. But this is the general places in which each of these watch houses stood for the period. So what did these structures look like? Watch houses were impermanent buildings of various sizes. They were made from wood so they could be easily taken apart and moved. An early description for the building of a watch house was as such, quote, "Ordered that Mr. John Bernard does forthwith build a watch house of 8 foot square with a sentry box on top to stand at the south end of the town." A memorandum prepared for the selectmen in 1761 tells us more about these buildings in the 1760s and 70s. The calculations described, again, another 8-foot structure, this time 8 foot by 8 foot with a hipped roof, the sloping roof on all 4 sides toward the walls of the square structure, as well as an exterior that was comprised of painted weatherboards or clapboards and a shingled roof. They also added that it should be adorned with shutters and a hinged door with a lock. Inside, the aesthetic would have been quite plain, with wooden floors and a brick pointed fireplace. I found a number of receipts and instructions, again, for repairs, but also another description for an erection of a watch house in 1769 showed that they grew in size over the period. At this time, they were asked to build a watch house of 12 feet square. Night watchmen petition for repairs quite often, arguing that plastering, repointing chimneys, and painting were all needed to keep the houses in working order, and particularly to keep them protected from the harsh elements during winter. So these watch houses, as they were apportioned throughout the town, provided a fixed place from which the men could observe the streets, while also offering shelter. During winters and in times of inclement weather, day constables would use the watch houses as well. On other occasions, watch houses were used by the town for men assigned to guard individuals who were ill with smallpox as well. From the watch houses, men set out in small groups of 2 to 3 watchmen to patrol the streets. One would always be kept back to stand sentry, so if someone came looking for assistance, they could call out to the other watchmen. The prescribed route set by the selectmen for the night watch laid out deliberate walking patterns to be repeated throughout the streets each night. The routes were adapted to accommodate the growing population and the addition of new streets and lanes, as well as to address the safety of the expanding waterfront, particularly the safety of property. But in addition to rounds, night constables and watchmen also navigated the streets to deliver individuals to various locations. This included the Bridewell, which was close to where you see this yellow circle, as well as the jail and the almshouse and justices of the peace. After each watch, the constable would bring any individuals that they needed to, that they detained, to see the justice of the peace that resided in their ward. So this movement and process and these physical structures, I argue, work together to create something that I call a landscape of order. The static structures that reinforced order, such as watch houses and jails and the Bridewell, suggest permanently the presence of a town's authority at work. But when combined with the prescribed route set by the selectmen for the night watch being repeated, these sanctioned movements encode stability onto the landscape. So these movements and connected spaces, set routes, and planned structures all signal watch authority within public and private spaces, accounting for this core strategy of how the town maintained and projected the idea of authority at night. So what did this work look like? The actual work of watchkeeping and keeping this authority at night. So the nightly watch and its connected network of other peace officers are tending to various types of order and disorder. Ordering the environment was a key piece, and this related to matters such as fire, disease, and keeping the streets clean themselves. Among the most important duties that was entrusted to the nightly watch was monitoring for fire. Fires threatened the safety of the town's inhabitants and posed a major threat to the town's economy. Watches worked in concert with other privately funded firefighting apparatuses within the town. And while these entities primarily responded to fires once they were ablaze, watchmen were considered the primary and essential tool for fire detection. In addition to calling out for fires, night constables and watchmen were assisting engines and inhabitants with the extinguishing of fires and later watching the embers as they burned out. In one particularly vivid accounting, Night Constable Isaac Townsend described the chaos of an outbreak of fire in 1767. In September, watchman Joseph Andrews first saw the great smoke as it ascended while standing sentry at the watch house door. Beholding the sight, Townsend dispatched watchman Charles Gilkey to the Old North to ring the bell. As he and Andrews dashed from the watch house, quote, Andrews and myself ran up and down the streets, crying fire to raise the inhabitants, it being 3:30 and they sound asleep. He wrote that in part thanks to the lack of wind that evening, but likely thanks to their quick actions, very humble, that the fire in Beer Lane was quickly extinguished. Townsend also remarked that a failure to extinguish the fire, quote, might have proved fatal to the north end, the fire having already caught the new brick steeple. But he credited the, quote, providence of God with its mitigation. In addition to rousing townspeople from sleep to bring their fire buckets, to sounding the alarm to summon the engines for the ward, we see that these measures suggest that watchmen bore a great responsibility in both the role of early intervention as well as to the end of the fire and to make sure that they do not spread beyond their sources. This related, of course, directly to their one of the main kind of other pieces of their work, which is the protection of property and commercial interests, particularly those tied to Boston's Atlantic trade. On nightly patrols, watchmen paid special attention, particularly to warehouses, stores, and wharves. Constables often remarked on their reports about warehouse doors being left unlocked and as to whether the goods inside had been disturbed. But beyond the work of looking to the environment and looking to property, communal care was also a prevalent and significant feature in the practice of watching. And one of the interesting features of the reports is that a great deal of the watch's time was spent administering care to its inhabitants. Duties related to illness kind of exist in this middle ground between keeping order and care. Night watches participated directly in quarantining townspeople, strangers, and travelers who took ill with various ailments, and were posted as watches in cases of smallpox. An outbreak of smallpox in 1764 gives us a bit of insight into how this worked in practice. Infected houses were marked with flags. Men, both watchmen and others, were paid by the town to act as guards to prevent the spread of infection. Guards were given these strict instructions, quote, to examine every person passing by you, whether they have had smallpox, or if they answer that they have not had it, or you should suspect that they have, you are then to prevent their proceeding with all proper methods. We depend upon your behaving with great care and faithfulness in your watch, and on your doing so, we shall make you proper allowance for your service. In February 1764, the town called upon watchman David Lennox Jr. to act as a guard for a house where a family was supposed to have, quote, considerable infection. Further, the selectmen instructed Isaac Townsend and the North Division to relieve Lennox at 11 o'clock at night and to keep watch until daybreak, a time to which the other guards would then return. That same month, Townsend reported to the selectmen that, quote, all hands of the watch took our turns to inspect the sick house. So a few other ways that the watch also participated in the overlap of administrative care were the attendance to people with mental illness or infirmities, and also the indigent. Working with day constables, warners, overseers, and others of the poor and others, the town watch were part of just this key contribution to an overall maintenance of community through efforts of care, such as those that I mentioned, and I dig into more deeply in the larger project. But of course, watchmen are also responding to a range of violent crimes and criminal disorders in any given month. Most common criminal concerns for the watch were, of course, property crimes such as theft, breaking and entering, and trespass, crimes against the person such as assault, attempted rape, and fighting, and disorders that pose a threat to community such as drunkenness, houses of ill fame, riots, and rows. So I will dig into just quickly a few examples of what some of these things look like. So social anxieties formed all manners of policing in early Boston. Acts passed by the general court were introduced to prevent disorders in the night, especially those related to vagrants, strangers, women, free and enslaved Black persons, and Native Americans. These measures subjected certain individuals to a heightened degree of scrutiny and observation by the nightly watch. Night constables' reports helped to illuminate the role that the watch practice played in local efforts to bring order to the complex social order of colonial Boston. So laws divide to discourage nocturnal activities and keep individuals off of public streets often targeted Boston's free and enslaved population. An act to prevent disorders in the night was devised as a corrective to alleged, quote, disorders, insolvencies, and burglaries that oftentimes were committed in the night by Indian, Negro, and mulatto servants and slaves to the disquiet and hurt of Her Majesty's good subjects. The act restricted these enumerated groups from being abroad at night after 9 o'clock, but also required watchmen, along with justices of the peace, constables, and even householders to detain anyone who did not give a satisfactory account or were to be found making any kind of disturbance or misbehavior. And then they were required to take them before a justice of the peace for discipline or correction. So in response to fears over insurrection, again, at a much smaller scale than we would see in a place like Charleston or New York, the town watch was expanded multiple times over the beginning of the 18th century, with more men being added in additional watch houses and adjustments to the walking routes for more vigilant coverage. Monitor Boston's Black population was actually included as one of the enumerated duties in the watch's orders that they were given. Most of the orders pertain again to their own conduct and walking of the routes, but this is the one specific order that pertains to any particular group. And over time, I found that these procedures for this duty evolve, and that as well as that, Boston's watchmen exercise a good deal of discretion in making decisions on how to execute this. But in 1767, the selectmen added the instruction that they were to take up all Negroes, Indians, and mulatto slaves away from their enslavers' home after 9 if they were found without lanterns lit with candles. So this addition was not something that was singular to Boston. New York and Charleston enforced similar laws, but this is something that sociologist Simone Brown refers to these racialized statutes and regulations of having a lit candle as a lantern law. Lanterns and lit candles were not for the person traveling to be able to see better, but rather it allowed someone to be seen. And I write that this is akin to almost a written pass. A lit candle signaled that an enslaver had permitted the perambulator to be abroad, but it was also a mechanism by which Black people were easier to locate and police by Boston's watch. So in addition to social anxieties over free and enslaved Bostonians, something that I can absolutely answer more questions on and go into far more detail in the larger project on this, but they are also the officers that were most likely to respond to incidents concerning children, the elderly, and episodes of sexual and physical violence. Thomas Bradford alludes to this role when he writes, quote, "We are called to houses now and then again to make peace." At times, I think one of the more interesting things I found in these reports were constables and watchmen acted as mediators to diffuse domestic discord between husbands and wives, and other times residents and boarders. In their capacity as peacekeepers, constables and watchmen broke up acts of violence and attempted to broker reconciliations. Only the most extreme cases of marital violence end up in courts of law. So many abused women would have relied on these unofficial mediation and remediation tactics that were used by the town watch. Instances recorded by the watch illuminate how female residents used night watchmen to disrupt active violence, and even a handful of examples reveal how they sought out the town watch to help resolve these disputes, and in some cases, even calling upon them to act as informal advocates, where they assist individuals in their attempt to seek redress through legal channels. They actually accompany women to go see justices of the peace to file claims. So these are some of just a little bit of insight, and you can see in some of these reports that are in the background, just kind of some of the language of what these types of incidents look like. But again, I'm talking about the 1760s and 1770s, so I would be remiss if I did not dig into ever so briefly before closing the particular moment in which our watchmen are walking the streets of Boston, and that is during the imperial crisis and then the occupation of Boston and the coming of the Revolution. So in addition to serving in their regular capacity as watchkeepers and in their normal lives, in the 1760s and 1770s, the men of Boston's watch also witnessed and participated in many of the well-known events that occurred as part of the larger contest for empire. And there we go. And here are just a few of the reports that show some of the things I will mention. As crowds gathered in the streets to protest the Stamp Act, watchmen were instructed to patrol vigilantly. They witnessed the destruction of the houses of Secretary Andrew Oliver and Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, and reported on these events to the town selectmen. On the right, you can see that Isaac Townsend alludes that the town was full of disorder, not to be regulated by our powers, despite the fact that the watch had additional men added to it. As tensions escalated, a handful of watchmen even signed their names to agreements for the non-importation of British goods, while others remained neutral. Members of the watch skirmished with King's forces, and on other occasions, they protected royal officers and soldiers from the townspeople's abuses. They helped to carry away and care for the dead and the dying from King Street on the night of March the 5th, 1770. When the tea ships arrived in 1773, the town watch patrolled in tandem with the special watches that were convened. Amidst the mounting chaos of 1774 and 1775, watchmen continued to walk the streets until the normal functions of government were suspended. They resumed their duties after the siege of Boston, in a town that was ravaged by occupation, minus, of course, those few watchmen that had departed with the British for Halifax and the evacuation. As witnesses and participants, night constables participated in several aspects of the occupation and filled up many sheets of paper with copious details of the difficulties they faced. They amended their practices and regular duties in response to the burdens of occupation, and in turn, the practice of watchkeeping adapted in the face of these new demands of governance. The Army's arrival introduced competing structures, routes, and bodies into the landscape that threatened to overwhelm that balance of order that I described previously. And during the occupation of Boston, we find two police forces, one a municipal entity representing local political order, and another a military force representing imperial governments, confronting one another in the streets. Regular tasks such as calling the weather, asking after travelers, became political and highly contested actions. Tensions and uncertainty led British officers, soldiers, and Boston's watchmen to engage in a variety of confrontations, ranging from verbal insults to physical violence over the questions of jurisdiction and the right to police Boston's streets. I will offer one brief example from the occupation before I close. In the spring of 1774, under the Coercive Acts, the Boston Port Bill closed the town to commercial activity, and the Massachusetts Government Act dissolved the General Court and Assembly, installing a military government. General Thomas Gage returned to Boston as its military governor, arriving in May of 1774, accompanied by 4 regiments. The economic dislocation wrought by the Boston Port Bill brought a variety of new men to watch service. The Committee of Donations took responsibility for receiving and dispersing the money that was sent to Boston, and used some of that for the employment and relief of people affected by the Port Act by enlisting them in watch service. The act, of course, had threatened the livelihood of merchants and laborers and mechanics and other wage earners who depended on shipping and trade. Laboring men who lost their steady work due to the embargo faced difficulties in providing food and shelter, and this posed an overwhelming burden on the town's poor relief funds. The list you can see on this slide are the men who were nominated to come to watch service. And here is an example of a report that shows the listing of both the regular watchmen who are serving and then the additional men from who are employed under the funds from the Committee of Donations. So from the compiled list, we have 40 men who are recommended in either late December or January who begin to take up watch service sometime in late January. Watch work became a means to support unemployed members of the town in a period of unprecedented economic hardship. Further, the expansion of the size and duties of the watch came to stand in for Bostonians' rights to continue to exercise their chartered rights of self-governance. So amidst this chaos, from this period of May of 1774 to the closing of Boston in June of 1775, Boston's town watch continued to perform those regular duties. They looked for fire, they assisted in the containment of smallpox, responded to those domestic disturbance calls, and protected what assets humanly possible. Disagreements, though, continued with members of the British Army over those issues, such as the right to hail someone in the street or to detain someone. And this often led to more and more escalating violent encounters between military personnel and watchmen. I'll briefly share one example of such a violent encounter, to which John Rowe described in his diary. In a fray happened between officers and the town watch last evening, which caused great uneasiness within the town. And the night that he's talking about is January 20th, 1775. However, this is one of 6 incidents like this that happened over that month alone. So this was termed in the press and by town authorities as a high-handed riot. And this is a language that kind of prevailed during this second occupation period as a way to highlight the imperious dimensions of the officers' actions. But around 10 o'clock, a group of officers left a public house where they'd been drinking and attacked the townhouse watch, beating a man who was stationed in the street, quote, in the most shocking manner, and abusing several others. Boston resident John Andrews wrote that the West End Watch responded to the call to assist, and upon their arrival, a general battle ensued, with men being wounded on both sides. British Lieutenant John Barker told a completely different story. He claimed that the riot had occurred because a watchman insulted an officer. He remarked that in front of a crowd of townspeople and officers, the watchmen had, quote, brandished their hooks and other weapons, prompting several officers to draw their swords. Injuries ensued on both sides. Barker even included the horrific detail, quote, one of the watch lost a nose, another a thumb, and many other less conspicuous wounds. I never found something that corroborated someone losing a nose, but if anyone ever finds that, please do let me know. Several constables of the watch composed written formal complaints over these abuses of January 1775. And Governor General Thomas Gage ordered that a court inquiry be formed to investigate these recent riots between the officers and the town watch. The serious nature led Gage to give orders to his officers and the soldiers that, quote, attacking the watch of any town in all parts of the world must be attended to with bad consequence. For as they are appointed by law, the laws will protect them, and that no person who quarrels with them will get any satisfaction. And for injuries he may receive, he will be condemned. Gage's declaration was significant for several reasons that I explore in my larger project. But most importantly, Gage made a declaration to support local authority at a moment in which most local legal and governing power was tenuous at best. The Massachusetts Government Act that made him governor had ended chartered rights of the province and severely limited the scope of the power of Boston's town meeting. The town watch continued to operate, however, in this somewhat liminal space, keeping the peace by order of the town, but also implicitly by permission of the military government. So Gage's statement acknowledges the legality of the town watch's appointment and the laws that protect them. And further, by extending the framing of the statement to include attacking the watch in all parts of the world, Gage affirmed the place of watchkeeping as an institution of stability for governance, whether in Boston or points throughout the empire. So it's difficult to say, of course, how many of the men of Boston Watch, how they would have positioned themselves quite in the politics leading up to the revolution. As I mentioned, we know at least 11 members signed the non-importation pledge in 1767. The affiliations and actions of Thomas Gruby Worrall suggest heavily some loyalist leanings. He remains in Boston for the duration of the 9-month siege, but he and 6 members of his family depart with the British for Halifax in 1776. We know that other watchmen joined the Continental Army. One such example was Edward Langford, who was one of the men who testified in the Boston Massacre trials. So the men of Boston's watch bore witness to crisis and disruption as town officials and as ordinary Bostonians. They weathered the rhythms of the province's transition in government and navigated the growing military presence. Reading watch reports and complaints as eyewitness accounts offers a different perspective of how Boston experienced and responded to these disorienting effects. At the end of the American Revolution, Boston's watch had provided a physical presence that supported order, community networks, and Atlantic trade for nearly 150 years. Boston's residents listened to night constables and watchmen announce the time on patrol and answered their calls to attend to fires. Individuals relied on the watch when in danger or need, and some found their way into the watch's custody for unlawful activity. Night watches were just one element of a larger network of lower town officials whose commonplace actions and activities supported order and governance. Boston's watch as an institution and a practice adapted to the challenges of labor and service while supporting order and care. The men of Boston's watch, while belonging to lower and middling sorts, policed the streets to uphold elite ideas about respectability and civility. They exercised their discretion and care, choosing when to enforce restrictions and who should be considered exempt. While at times they functioned as mediators, at many others, they acted as agents upholding the racial, class, and gendered order of Boston. However, in the words of Isaac Townsend, the watch was motivated, as I argue, in both extraordinary and mundane times by their desire to keep, quote, peace and good order in the streets. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. There
Thank you.
are any questions either from those in the room or those online? Yes, Don.
You mentioned that there were personal relationships among the watchmen. Was there any pattern of family attraction to this, where they passed down to sons and grandsons, or brothers and other relations, forming a core the way we so often find now in fire departments and police departments? Was there a core group? I didn't notice it in the name.
Could everyone hear the question? It was about family relationships, if there are patterns as there are among police and firefighters today that is being passed down from in generations, if you found any evidence of that in your research.
Yes, John, thank you. Thank you for your excellent question. That was one of the original things that I dug into when trying to investigate some of the backgrounds of Watchmen. As Bob mentioned, I was lucky to be a NERFC fellow, and I spent 3 weeks at the New England Genealogical Society. So thank you so much again to everyone who helped me in my first foray into genealogy there. There are no patterns of father-son inheritance as you see with some of the other, town offices where you see selectmen and justices of the peace and overseers of the poor, where you have, or sheriffs. That's a great example of kind of like familial ties between people who serve. The only father-son duo who show up in any of the records are David Lennox Jr. and David Lennox Sr. And the son starts to serve because the father becomes ill. He serves as his replacement. You can get people to serve in your stead. And I think in that case is just, it wasn't so much that he inherited from it. For a while, they served at the same time. And then after his father dies in 1766, David Lennox Jr. stays on for a short period. But it's certainly not kind of, as I mentioned, Watchmen wasn't really an identity in the sense that, say, policing or fire families, I think, are an identity in our modern day. So I think that also, kind of the piece of status, you weren't necessarily inheriting a position of status either. So I have not found any patterns there. But that's not to say that is for Boston. While I've done research on other locales, I've never actually traced out whether they had kind of family inheriting pattern structures and watches in other places, though.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Joyce first.
Thank you so much for the presentation. 2 questions about change over time. Referring to the introduction of artificial illumination in Boston, I wonder if there was any alteration in procedure, perception of what the watch could or couldn't do. And the other would be about possibly, if you have any knowledge about insurance, whether changes in the watch or changes in insurance, what's the relationship, if any, in terms of how people thought of protecting themselves privately versus this public conducting. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Those are 2 fantastic questions. And my answers will probably not be very satisfying, mostly for the fact that my research thus far has been largely just in the colonial period. I kind of ended my dissertation research in about the 1780s, with only very brief kind of cursory look at the different changing laws in the 1790s. Because there's such a brief period from 1773 to when you have the siege, where they are lighting the lamps, I don't really have enough reports per se to be able to kind of create a pattern where I notice a pattern of difference. The only kind of observation I've thus far been able to make about that is there's not a decrease in the number of watchmen. And there's actually an increase, but that has to do with occupation. And that there is the kind of addition of there are more men who are then employed to become lamplighters. In places like Philadelphia, watchmen were always the lamplighters themselves. They were not a separate entity. But those are kind of the two observations I've thus far made about that. One of the kind of goals of the manuscript is to think a little bit forward. The Boston Watch does stay in operation until 1854, which is alongside also the creation of Boston's police. So kind of looking at how those things change over time. I had not actually thought about insurance, but I really appreciate that suggestion. I will think about that going forward. Thank you.
Yes.
Is that firefighting organizations are private insurance? Because they don't have a kind of entire civic operation the way the watch does. So that might be a proxy, at least, or a kind of similar phenomenon for the colonial period. Thank you.
Interesting.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Unfortunately, part of your presentation, when you were talking about their role as a mediator, broke up. Could I have you repeat a little bit of that? It just, we couldn't hear.
A
what you were
technical
saying.
issue, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yes, not a problem at all. So one of my chapters in my research tries to kind of dig into what are some of these roles in terms of the complex social dynamics and how Boston's Watch kind of operates outside of what those enumerated duties are that they're given in their appointments. And one of the ways that I look at that is looking at how they acted as mediators in kind of domestic situations. I found a good handful of reports where they are called upon to go in to both people's homes and in public to deal with instances of domestic violence. And part of what I found really, fascinating, obviously, this is something I discussed, with Nina at length, and thinking about kind of what can we learn from these, particularly because so many cases of domestic violence, only the most severe are the ones you would find in court records. So what can we learn about how ordinary people might have used the watch in these scenarios? And in several of these reports, we have men from the watch being called to respond to cases where women are in duress, some of which they go in, they break up the scenario, they might remove the husband, bring him to a justice of peace, have him, sworn over to the peace for the night, and then, his wife will collect him the next day. But I found other reports where they are either using the same person over and over again, so patterns where you're bringing into the same homes to help with this scenario, and also places in which they're calling upon the watch to help them. One instance of which is where Isaac Townsend actually does outside research to try to figure out the circumstances of this one particular couple, the Douglases, and he asks questions of others to kind of figure out what's going on, and then he works with the woman's mother to go and file a complaint because he was just as I said, his reports are quite verbose. So he discusses how, beside himself, he was about the egregious way that she was wounded and was not satisfied with the fact that her husband would just be turned back over to her. So kind of looking at this pattern, I saw this and kind of interpreted it in some way as a kind of informal mediation. It's not something that the town asked them to do. It's not something that that is required of them, but kind of where they take on these because they are also members of the town. I mean, that's the interesting kind of part about watchmen is, as I said, it's not a professionalized entity yet. it's not, you don't have particularly the full apparatus of welfare necessarily in this sense. You have welfare like apparatus in terms of overseers of the poor, but they're kind of working in this interesting liminal space. I see them as in what I call mediation.
Thank you. Gorman Lee has a question in the chat about finding any mention of major events, key events, particularly those leading to the American Revolution, and if the writings you found provide unique perspectives or insights into these events.
So I am arguing that in kind of over 2 chapters in the dissertation, I will do this over more chapters in the book manuscript, that looking at local level policing, looking at occupation and these particular events through the lens of local level policing is something that we have not done or really thought about, and it brings kind of a different perspective for us. I mean, I dig into the particular places where I have good accounts for this. I look at the Stamp Act. I look at I argue that you should treat the first occupation of Boston from 1768 to 1770 as one entity, and I do that in one chapter, versus the second occupation in a second chapter. And then I also, I drawing and building on the great work about the Boston Massacre by Serena Zabin and many others, kind of look at what, how the watch functioned within those places. And one of the things that I found that I think is particularly interesting and want to expand upon this for my in my manuscript is the kind of piece I introduced at the end about Thomas Gage and what they learn about occupying and police forces in Boston is that once they move on from Boston, they never again do not commandeer the local policing force. So I'm also interested in the ways in which that, thinking about how these particular moments of, these jurisdictional challenges, what they say about, the actual occupation itself, but what also is learned from this for the British Army moving forward. So it's something I can elaborate on more too.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments for Nicole? Well, thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you for inviting me.
Look forward to reading more, and I look forward to having you back here at the Colonial Society at some point. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, either virtually or actually, and those who are actually here will now adjourn for refreshments. So happy holidays to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.